Welcome to the Best Ever PC Benchmark channel. Today we're on Far Cry 6, powered by a stock AMD Ryzen 7 9800X3D and NVIDIA RTX 3090. I'm capturing everything using Cap Frame X and Riva Tuner. Quick stat: over 96% of you watching aren't subscribed. Let's flip that. Help us hit 1,000 subs by liking, commenting, and smashing that subscribe button. Let's dive into the benchmarks. Let's kick things off at 1080p, native resolution, no ray tracing, no upscalers. Just pure rasterized performance in Far Cry 6 using the RTX 3090 at Ultra, Medium, and Low presets. Ultra. At Ultra settings, we're averaging a rock-solid 150 FPS. This preset enables the full suite of visual features, rich draw distances, dense foliage, detailed character models, and all the eye candy Far Cry 6 can throw at us. The game looks absolutely fantastic. Lighting, shadows, and textures are crisp, and reflections shimmer off the water beautifully. During intense moments, explosions, fire effects, or dense enemy encounters, the frame rate holds up well. Occasional dips into the high hundreds, but never enough to break fluidity. If you're running a 120Hz or 144Hz display, you're going to get the full benefit here. And most importantly, gameplay remains responsive and smooth throughout long engagements and while zipping through the open world on vehicles. Medium. Switching down to medium settings, we're now seeing an average of 160 FPS. You still retain much of the game's core fidelity. Textures look great, shadows are a bit softer, and environmental effects are scaled back slightly. But the extra frames are well worth it if you prefer a more competitive or latency-sensitive experience. Animations feel snappier, and aiming responsiveness improves slightly, especially noticeable when using a mouse. Even in busy areas like checkpoints or towns with lots of NPCs, frame pacing stays consistent. This setting is ideal for high refresh rate gamers who want to balance visuals with speed. Low. Drop things down to low, and you unlock the full power of the RTX 3090, 170 FPS average. This setting is all about raw performance. Draw distances shrink, lighting effects are minimal, and overall visual complexity is reduced. But the speed gain is huge. Frame times are extremely consistent, which means ultra-low input latency and perfect motion clarity. This is the go-to mode if you're running a 165Hz plus panel or just want the absolute fastest experience for fast-paced combat. Even when explosions go off or multiple enemies appear on screen, you won't notice a single hitch. It's Far Cry 6 at its most fluid. Pure responsiveness, no compromise. Now we move up to 1440p, native, still with no ray tracing or upscaling. This is where we start to lean harder on GPU muscle, and the RTX 3090 doesn't disappoint. Ultra. With everything cranked to Ultra at 1440p, we're seeing an average of 140 frames per second. The visuals here are stunning. Lush jungles, dynamic weather, crisp shadows, and high-fidelity textures that really make Far Cry 6 pop at this resolution. This is a visually demanding preset, but the RTX 3090 chews through it like it's nothing. Frame pacing stays tight even during combat, with effects like smoke, volumetric lighting, and explosions not dragging performance down. Whether you're gliding over the landscape in a wingsuit or pushing through a chaotic firefight, the experience remains responsive and immersive. You can comfortably pair this with a 100Hz plus display and enjoy smooth, cinematic visuals without compromise. Medium. Dialing things back to medium, we're now hovering at an average of 150 frames per second. This is the sweet spot if you want that extra performance buffer without giving up too much on visual quality. The world still looks rich. Textures hold up, lighting is toned down just enough, and most of the high-impact visuals are still present. The extra headroom helps eliminate any potential frame drops during intense gameplay segments, keeping the experience buttery smooth. This preset is perfect for fast travel, gunplay-heavy missions, or roaming densely populated areas with zero stutter or lag. For most players with a 144Hz display, medium at 1440p is going to feel like the perfect balance. Low. On low settings, the RTX 3090 opens up fully, pushing an average of 190 frames per second. You lose some environmental detail, volumetrics, and complex shadows, but in return, you get unmatched responsiveness. This preset is all about smoothness, fast aiming, quick turns, and minimal input latency. Explosions, AI activity. Vehicles, it all flies by without a single dip. Even when chaos breaks out and fire effects fill the screen, performance holds strong and never falters. If you're playing competitively or just prefer a sharper edge and responsiveness, this is the way to go at 1440p. Let's take a close look at how Far Cry 6 handles anti-aliasing at 1080p Ultra, running on the RTX 3090 with no upscaling and no ray tracing. At 1080p Ultra, SMAA gives us an average of around 130 FPS, and visually, it holds up well if you're chasing high frame rates. The image stays sharp with only minor overhead, and most interior scenes or close-range encounters look clean and detailed. But once you step outside into the open-world chaos of Far Cry 6, the limitations show. Tree lines, distant rooftops, and chain-link fences shimmer slightly in motion, especially when panning fast across the horizon. It's subtle, but if you're used to cleaner temporal solutions, the flicker might stand out, particularly in jungle-heavy areas or when cruising at high speeds. Switching over to TAA, frame rates drop slightly to around 150 FPS, but the improvement in stability is instantly noticeable. Those shimmering edges are mostly gone. Vegetation sways naturally, distant detail locks in without crawling, and the game takes on a more cohesive, almost filmic tone. The trade-off: a layer of softness coats the image. Rock textures, building edges, even skin and clothing lose a bit of clarity, especially if you're standing still and taking in the view. But during motion-heavy gameplay, that softness actually blends things together in a way that feels polished. If you're all about crispness and speed, SMAA keeps things snappy. But if you're leaning into immersion and visual fluidity, TAA is the better bet, even with the hit to sharpness. Both options feel solid, but the difference is clear depending on how you prefer to play. Let's see how upscaling affects performance and visuals at 1080p Ultra settings. This test focuses on AMD's Fidelity FX tools, CAS for sharpening and FSR1 for performance gains. Both are lightweight, but deliver very different results. Fidelity FX CAS. Using Fidelity FX CAS alone, we're averaging around 160 frames per second. Now, CAS isn't a traditional upscaler, it's more of a sharpening pass. You're still rendering at native resolution, but with enhanced edge definition and clarity. Performance sees a negligible improvement over no upscaler at all, but image sharpness looks better, especially in foliage and distant geometry. Gameplay feels nearly identical to pure native rendering, with a very minor bump in responsiveness. This is a great option if you want a crisper image without sacrificing quality or introducing visual artifacts. It's basically a free improvement with no downsides. Good if you're already at high FPS and want to clean up the image. FSR1. Switching to FSR1 in quality mode, we're now pushing an average of 170 FPS. This is a solid 15 to 20% boost compared to native, and it's immediately noticeable in responsiveness. The image still holds up well. There's some loss in fine detail if you really look closely, but in motion, the difference is minimal. FSR1's edge reconstruction does a decent job maintaining overall sharpness, even when sprinting through dense jungle or engaging in firefights. For those looking to keep frame rates high on a 144Hz panel or reduce system strain without compromising too much on visuals, this is the smarter pick. It's a clean blend of image quality and performance, perfect for fast-paced open-world gameplay. At 1440p Ultra, the RTX 3090 continues to hold strong. And this is where anti-aliasing choices become even more noticeable due to the higher pixel density. Let's see how SMAA and TAA affect both visuals and performance. At 1440p Ultra, SMAA delivers around 120 frames per second on average, and compared to 1080p, the higher resolution naturally enhances clarity across the board. The image looks tighter, and the aliasing issues that stood out at lower resolutions, like flickering wires and shimmering foliage, are noticeably reduced, though not entirely gone. Movement through dense environments like towns or jungles still reveals some fine edge crawl, but it's subtle enough that most players won't find it distracting. SMAA here strikes a strong balance. Performance is excellent, visuals remain sharp, and it preserves that crisp texture fidelity without pushing the GPU too hard. TAA drops the frame rate slightly to around 60 FPS, but the visual payoff is clear. That last bit of edge shimmer gets cleaned up, and vegetation, power lines, and distant objects all look much smoother, especially when sprinting, turning rapidly, or driving through open terrain. At this resolution, the softening effect that TAA is known for becomes less of an issue. The image still has a touch of blur compared to SMAA, but the higher pixel density helps mask it, making the overall presentation feel more polished and cohesive. If you're focused on immersion and smoother edge transitions, TAA is the better choice. Just expect a small performance dip. At 1440p Ultra, things start to lean more heavily on GPU horsepower, but upscalers step in to keep things smooth. We're comparing Fidelity FX CAS and FSR1 quality, both designed to help without compromising the experience. Fidelity FX CAS. Using Fidelity FX CAS, we're averaging around 140 frames per second. Just like at 1080p, CAS isn't changing your render resolution. It's simply sharpening what's already there. That means visual clarity improves slightly, especially in distant textures, rocky terrain, and fine details like wires and foliage. The best part? Virtually no performance penalty. You're still playing at native 1440p, just with a cleaner looking image. Whether you're flying across the map or taking cover during chaotic missions, the frame rate remains stable and responsive. This is an easy pick if you want native quality with just a bit more clarity. No artifacts, no compromises. FSR1. Switching to FSR1 quality mode, the frame rate jumps to 160 FPS on average. That's a noticeable gain, more than 15 FPS extra over native rendering. FSR scales down the resolution before upscaling it intelligently, and while you lose a touch of texture detail, the trade-off is worth it. It holds up surprisingly well even in motion-heavy scenes like driving or large-scale battles. Image sharpness isn't quite CAS level, but responsiveness and smoothness easily make up for it. At 1440p, Ultra FSR1 delivers an excellent performance uplift. Perfect for players chasing fluid motion on high refresh rate displays without dialing back quality settings too far. Ray tracing in Far Cry 6 mainly affects reflections and shadows. While it's not as aggressive as in some other modern titles, it still takes a noticeable toll on performance. Let's break it down by resolution. 1080p Ultra RT, no upscalers. With ray tracing enabled at Ultra, the RTX 3090 holds an average of 120 frames per second at 1080p. That's about a 25% drop from non-RT Ultra, but the game still feels responsive. You'll notice improved reflections on wet surfaces, car bodies, and water, especially during night missions or rainy weather. Shadows gain subtle softening and depth, which adds a bit of realism without going overboard. The frame rate never feels sluggish, and the dips are rare enough that the overall experience remains smooth. For players who want cinematic visuals at 1080p and aren't chasing max refresh rates, this setting is perfectly viable. The hybrid implementation here makes RT a realistic option without tanking performance like in heavier RT titles. 1440p, Ultra RT, no upscalers. At 1440p, with Ultra Ray Tracing, the RTX 3090 averages around 100 FPS. This is where the card starts to feel the load, especially during fast driving or urban firefights. Still, 65 frames per second is entirely playable, and the game benefits visually from the ray trace lighting touches. Water and glass reflections look noticeably more dynamic, and shadow detail in foliage-heavy areas improves subtly. If you're on a 60Hz display or playing with controller input, it feels great. But for mouse and keyboard players on high refresh rate monitors, you might want to pair this with upscalers or drop to high RT. Overall, it's a solid showcase of how Far Cry 6 uses RT wisely. Is the RTX 3090 still enough for Far Cry 6 in 2025? Absolutely. Whether you're at 1080p or 1440p, Far Cry 6 runs incredibly well on the RTX 3090 with all settings maxed. Upscalers like FSR1 and CAS push FPS even higher. And while ray tracing adds a performance dip, it's perfectly playable. If this helped you decide, hit like, tell me what game to benchmark next, and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subs. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.